What's going on, AUHSD geographers? It is Mr. M. I am here to cover the next week, week 2 of political geography. Now, last week, our material really focused on the basic unit of political geography, and that is the state, also known as the country. And obviously, states are the basic function of government, worldwide. And states obviously have external boundaries, right, that show the limits of their territory. And they also have internal boundaries, right, that often subdivide their country into subunits. For instance, in the United States, we are subdivided into 50 states. In Canada and Europe, most of the countries are divided into provinces, all right? And those have boundaries as well, right? We have outer boundaries in the United States, and then, of course, we have internal boundaries, right, that separate the 50 various states, right? Well, all of our focus this week is on boundaries, all right? Some of us need them, and quite frankly, so do some countries around the world as well. We'll also talk very briefly about state shapes in this video. Now, before we begin, one thing. There are videos embedded in this PowerPoint presentation. You must watch these videos. I am not going to show those linked videos during my presentation. You should stop my presentation at that spot, and then you should play the video alongside me. All right? So let's get right into political geography, please. Boundaries. A boundary is an invisible line, and it marks the extent of a state's territory. Hey, keep in mind boundaries go up into the air, right? That's how we get the concept of airspace. They also go underground, all right? So a country's boundaries are just not on Earth's surface. They extend upward and downward as well. They can be difficult to set. There's oftentimes a lot of disagreement on boundaries, especially between neighboring countries. And so, therefore, there has historically and continues to be a lot of conflict that has been caused because of boundary disputes. Every boundary falls into one of two categories. Physical or cultural. So first off, when we're understanding boundaries, we're going to divide them into either physical or cultural boundaries. Physical boundaries are simple. They overlap a significant feature on the natural landscape like rivers, mountains, or lakes. Cultural, there is no physical feature there to separate those two countries, and so we're going to use a cultural one instead. Maybe we look at what languages are spoken and we create a boundary that separates those two languages. Maybe we do that with two religions in an area. Maybe we do it with ethnic groups, so that ethnic groups that are already living in a border region will draw the border in between where they live to separate them. Really, any boundary that is man-made because it just does not correspond to an actual physical feature is cultural. Shoot, if I draw a straight line as a boundary, that's a cultural boundary as well. Now, hey, here's the thing. Most of the time, boundaries are a combo of physical and cultural together. In some parts of the boundary, it may be a physical obstacle. In others, it may be man-made or cultural. So, boundaries, for instance, look at the United States, right? In the United States, just with our boundary with Canada, right, we have physical boundaries, the Great Lakes, that are our official boundaries. And then we have some cultural ones, like the 49th parallel, which is a straight line, right, that we draw from the Great Lakes all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So again, it's a combo of both physical and cultural together. Okay, so every country, in order to be a country or state, has to have territory with established boundaries. However, there are what are called some frontiers left around the world. A frontier is a border region between multiple countries, but none of those countries are actually able to exercise complete control over the border. So it's kind of open, it's undefined. There's nothing there to note when you are leaving one country and going into another. It's just an unoccupied, uninhabited frontier. Now, frontiers usually occur in really harsh areas. For instance, a desert region that separates two countries. If it's harsh desert, right, neither country may be able to effectively patrol, monitor, and secure that region. And so they both recognize it's the border region, but there are no boundaries there. That's a frontier, right? And nobody really is able to effectively control it. Most of the world was originally a frontier. However, today, most of the frontiers throughout history have been occupied and boundaries have been established and marked. A good example is the U.S. West, the American West, you know. Most of the land in the western U.S. was at one point a frontier, the Wild West. It wasn't really claimed by settlers or any states because so few people had migrated out there. And so basically, you could head out into the West. It was, I don't want to say lawless, but there wasn't a lot of governmental control. You could claim land, right, for yourself. And no country really was able to control it at the time. You know, Britain claimed it, the U.S. claimed it, Spain claimed portions of the West as well, Russia did, but none of them were really able to, in the 1850s, effectively control that area. And so it was just a frontier that everybody claimed, but nobody actually possessed. Well, over time, the U.S. was able to build up their military, build up their population, and to actually establish control over that area. And so it became a border over time. Today, where do we see frontiers? Well, some uninhabited Middle Eastern desert areas. The dense Amazon rainforest. I'm talking about the regions that are so dense in the interior that they're virtually uninhabited. And also some mountainous areas, and that's where I'm going to ask you to stop this video, to pause it, and to click on this link on Nepal and China. It's going to give you an awesome video here that explains to you the concept of frontiers. Go ahead and click on that video now and watch it, and then come back to me when you are done. Okay, welcome back. Wanted to mention to you, now, first off, how awesome is that video? Right? That region is most definitely a frontier region, but China, as you can see, is clearly making that less of a frontier and turning it more into an established border region, right? And of course, the people that lose in that situation, of course, are the herders who migrate across those areas and have historically, right? So there's a good example of a frontier that is slowly going away. By the way, Antarctica today is considered the largest frontier on Earth. Some people might argue portions of the ocean are as well. I even heard recently somebody try to argue that space will be the next frontier as well. All right, let's get in more into these boundaries, right? Because a frontier really doesn't have established boundaries, but we're focused on actual established boundaries this week. And first off, physical boundaries. That would mean water is the most common. Rivers, lakes, oceans. Makes a lot of sense, right? They're easy to see. They clearly are marked. So you know when you're leaving one country and going into another if there is a river boundary or an ocean boundary. So water is the most common. Interestingly enough, water boundaries usually run right down the middle of the water source. What I mean by that is if a river separates two countries, they'll actually divide the boundary right in the middle of the river so that each country technically gets 50% of the waterway. All right. Mountains and deserts boundaries are less common, but they are still considered very effective physical boundaries, right? Let's face it. Mountains and deserts are generally tough to cross, like water. They are generally very sparsely populated for a reason because they are uninhabitable or they are harsh. And let's face it, mountains and deserts tend to be pretty permanent, right? Especially mountains. And so that's going to be a steady, reliable boundary that you're going to be able to use essentially for eternity. Cultural boundaries, my goodness, there's a number of them. Let's start with geometric. A geometric boundary is simple. It's a straight line. And it is usually drawn to correspond to a line of latitude or longitude. And oftentimes, if we don't have a better boundary to use, we'll just use a nearby line of latitude or longitude, and that creates geometric boundaries because it creates straight lines. Many geometric boundaries are also what are called superimposed, which I will get to in the next slide. All right. Religious boundaries are another type of cultural boundary. A religious boundary is simply a boundary that is designed to separate religions, right? Oftentimes, if you didn't have a better boundary to use, you might use religious boundaries. The British were known for doing this. India is a really good example. When India and Pakistan were decolonized, The boundary between the two countries was not set. England decided to draw it. They basically used religion as the difference maker. And Muslims were on the west side and Hindus were on the east. And the line was drawn based upon that. Of course, that led to millions and millions of folks having to move. Those unfortunate souls that were trapped on the wrong side of that boundary. Ireland and Northern Ireland, another good example, right? There are religious boundaries there. Predominantly Protestants live in the north. Catholics live throughout the rest of the country. There's also language boundaries in these areas, right? So that's another way to divide two countries, right? And that's, of course, a boundary that is drawn to separate more than one language. All right? All right, let's get into our next categories. Generally speaking, every boundary will fall into one of these four categories as well, at least one of these four categories. Antecedent. An antecedent boundary is a boundary that's drawn prior to the area being well populated and prior to the cultural landscape being developed. So you usually will draw antecedent boundaries in advance, obviously, of an area being settled. If you're worried that when it does get settled, because you're expecting it to, it might lead to problems. It might lead to issues or disputes. And to prevent those from breaking out in the future, you go ahead and you draw the antecedent boundary ahead of time. All right? The western boundary between the United States and Canada was drawn this way. It was drawn generally before there were settlers in the region, and so the two governments just settled on the 49th parallel, that straight line, and said, okay, let's draw it ahead of time as an antecedent boundary to avoid conflict. The alternative, or the other side of that, is a consequent boundary. Consequent means after the fact, and consequent means that you draw the boundary after the area has been heavily populated, and or cultural or ethnic groups have settled. Usually you draw consequent boundaries because, well, there's conflict there. And you are trying to prevent this conflict from continuing. And so you try to draw a compromise boundary that will reduce or eliminate the conflict. Now, while the western border of the U.S. and Canada was antecedent, the eastern half was not. That was actually consequent. The area was settled by French and English settlers all throughout the border region. They started to clash with one another over fishing, hunting rights, and so ultimately these conflicts, these clashes, led the two countries to sign treaties in the 1840s that finalized that boundary once and for all. Superimposed boundaries are boundaries that are imposed or forced on an area by a conqueror, by a colonizing power, or by some outsider. Superimposed boundaries do not take pre-existing cultural patterns into account. What I mean by that is the outsider, the conqueror, basically draws their own boundaries and they don't care, or they don't pay attention, or they don't focus on the cultures in the region and what would be best for them. Obviously, our best examples of superimposed boundaries are Europeans in Africa with the Berlin Conference, and Europeans in Asia with the Balfour Declaration. These two classic examples are where Europeans basically just went into these areas and drew lines on maps. No Africans or Asians were involved. Of course, this led to so many problems in these regions as they developed afterwards. Finally, a relic boundary is a former boundary that used to have significance on Earth but no longer has any political significance. There are still remnants on it, on Earth's surface where it existed. You can still see remnants of it. You can see them like a relic from the past. And as a result, these boundaries are known as relic or relict boundaries. The Great Wall of China is a good example. It's no longer officially a boundary between China and the outside world like it used to be. Of course, it's still there, right? So you know that it was one. It's no longer one today. It's a relic of the past. Similar, the Berlin Wall is a good example of a relic boundary, right? In Germany during the Cold War, remnants of it still remain. The 17th parallel, North and South Vietnam used to be separate countries. They fought a civil war. Prior to that civil war, the country was divided in half. and it was divided at the 17th parallel. And so barbed wire and fences existed there. Signs existed there, indicating it was a border. There was a war there. The country unified. It just became Vietnam, so that border wasn't needed any longer. But there are still remnants or relics of it that still remain. Again, when we're looking at cultural boundaries, you need to ask yourself, is this a geometric? Is this religious? Is this language? You also have to ask yourself, hey, are these boundaries, is it antecedent or consequent? Is this a superimposed boundary by an outsider? Is this maybe a relic boundary, something from the past? All right. Oh, you thought we were done with boundaries, and you're wrong. We're about to get to the 3 Ds of boundaries. That's boundary setting. When two countries get together and they want to establish what boundaries will be, they have to go through 3 steps, the 3 Ds. The first is called definition. That's when an exact location is going to be established through a legal agreement, through a treaty. It usually describes terrain features or longitude, latitude lines that are going to be used from this point forward to determine the legal definition of where that boundary is on paper. Then, delimitation is where you actually, now that you've negotiated through legal agreement the boundary and where it's going to be, now you actually delimit it. Now you actually go out and you mark that boundary on Earth's surface, and you make sure that it corresponds to the boundary on the map. All right? Then finally, demarcate's the final stage. Now you know where your boundary is, right? For instance, you've plowed the land. You can see where it is. You've both agreed on paper. You've both identified where that line is on Earth. Now demarcation, that's the final step. This is where you mark it. You mark it with whatever you choose. Maybe you want to put fences or walls up. Maybe just posts or pillars or other markers, just symbolizing, hey, you're leaving one area and heading into another. Demarcation is that final stage where you build up the boundary. Now, just FYI, most of the world's boundaries are not demarcated, all right? Most countries in the world do not actively demarcate their boundaries, so you not necessarily know when you're going from one to another. It won't be patrolled or marked, and so you may not even realize you've gone from one to the other. All right, boundary disputes. I've got some good ones for you. There are 2 videos here. You need to watch both of them. They are so amazing. All right, boundary disputes. So when a dispute happens over a boundary, it falls into one of 4 categories. First, definitional. Definitional is when you argue over the legal definition of the boundary. You can't even agree on the first step of the 3 Ds. You can't even figure out the general boundary that both sides can agree on, right? So this usually means, hey, we're struggling in negotiations, right? We can't even get to the point where we can establish basic rules as to defining where our boundary is. Oh, I think it's this river. No, I think it's this river 10 miles over. Well, we have different definitions, and we can't agree. All right? Locational is more about, hey, where a dispute about where the boundary actually is on Earth's surface. So what I mean by this is sometimes a country will establish fencing, they'll establish some sort of demarcation that's actually on the territory or the claimed territory of the other country. And so this is where you have a dispute literally over the physical location of the boundary on Earth's surface. Operational is when you disagree over how the boundaries are going to operate. What I mean by that is maybe one side wants to allow migration through and the other does not. Maybe one wants to build walls or militarize their border, and the other would be more comfortable with just allowing a free flow of immigration through. So it's when one country has a problem with how the border is operating. That could involve migrants, that could involve trade, that could involve any number of different factors. Drugs, all of those would, drugs being brought into a country, all of that would fall under that category. Guys, watch this amazing video. It's about 14 minutes long on the United States and Mexico and the operational border disputes that they have with one another. And then finally, your last boundary dispute is allocational. Allocational is a conflict over resources that exist along a border. So you are fighting now over the resources themselves that exist in the area. The money makers. Maybe there's oil or gas or minerals. Maybe you're fighting over the fresh water in a waterway or ocean resources, fish, right? Seafood, ocean plants. Any of those are an allocational dispute. Allocation means essentially to spread around resources. So it's a resource dispute. So definitional, agreeing over the legal definition. Basically, it's a disagreement on paper. Locational is disagreeing over the physical location on Earth. Operational is disagreeing over how the border is going to operate. Allocational is a disagreement about resources along that border. Please watch this second video as well. India and Sri Lanka. It's maybe the best example of an allocational dispute you can find, and it's good. All right? Watch both videos. You are going to be quizzed on both of them. Oh, quick review. State shapes. Guys, we used to spend a lot more time on this. College Board has announced we're not to spend more than just mentioning it exists. They're not really testing on this much anymore. Hey, states can't exist without territory. Geographers oftentimes study the shape and the size of a state. That's called morphology or geomorphology. And they do this usually to try to help explain advantages and disadvantages, all right? And why a state maybe has its population distributed the way it does. Again, they focus on the size of a shape and how it may provide certain advantages or disadvantages. First, large states. We're talking about states with large land area and or population. Especially land area, they usually have more resources. But more land means more area to defend and maintain and protect at the same time. Large states, usually a lot of resources, potentially a large population, room for more growth, but again, often difficult to maintain, to keep united, right? A lot of centrifugal force in larger states because of the large size. Smaller states obviously might have fewer resources. They might have less access to the ocean, which is huge in this day and age because of trade. But oftentimes it's easier to spread information, to communicate, to defend, to protect all at the same time. There are 5 major state shapes. So forget about size now. We're going to shapes that have been identified through morphology. The most ideal state is a compact state. You'll notice that it's kind of circular or squarish in shape. It's easy to manage, to govern, to defend, because the distance from the center to all the regions and boundaries doesn't vary. So you don't have an area that sticks out, right? You don't have an area that's indefensible, right? And it especially works well when the capital is somewhere near the center of the country, so that it can provide resources and jobs and assistance more evenly throughout the country. Fragmented states are states that have at least one fragment, one piece that is separate from the main body. They're usually separated. They can be separated by water, or you can be a fragmented state that's separated by another country. The U.S. is a fragmented state in both ways, right? First off, Alaska is a fragment from the rest of the country, and it's separated by Canada, by land. And then Hawaii is a fragment, right, that's separated from the rest of the country by water. Fragments obviously can be difficult to control, to communicate with, or protect. Oftentimes fragments, especially islands, might be areas where there's a lot of independence, devolution, and efforts to break away from the country. All right? This is definitely the case in like Hawaii. There was a strong independence movement there. In Indonesia, actually, one island, East Timor, recently declared independence. Again, you can be fragmented by water. Look at Indonesia. They have literally thousands of islands. There are thousands of fragments. And then Azerbaijan here, you'll see, has this fragment that's filled with folks that are Azerbaijani, but technically are separated from the rest of the country by another state. Your third state shape is called elongated. Elongated states are very long and generally narrow. They tend to struggle with communication, defense, and unity, especially towards the edges. And I think if you look at Chile as a good example, Vietnam as well, you can see why, right? How easy would it be to cut this country in half if you invaded it, right? So it would be very difficult to defend that. and to defend this humongous border all the way along it, right? It's also very difficult to maintain unity and communication, particularly in fragment areas. I should say in the extreme areas furthest away from the rest of the country. Prorupted or protruded states are a state that has some sort of appendage, some sort of, I always just say like an arm or a leg, that extends outward in an abstract way. The state would otherwise usually be compact if not for this proruption, and it sticks out like an appendage. The proruption is actually this little piece that sticks out. But the entire country is known as a prorupted state. Thailand's a good example, and there is the proruption. If you have just a funky kind of shaped piece of a country that doesn't seem like it fits with the rest of it, not totally sure why it was given, that's a proruption. Usually, it's to give a country access to resources that it otherwise wouldn't have, for instance, oil down here. But it can also be to give them access to the ocean, for a landlocked state, or to give them access to a port. It could be to maybe unify a nationality, right? So to keep a group of people together in one country who otherwise don't really live close to one another. And sometimes it can actually be used as a divider. We'll create a proruption to separate two other countries who are hostile with one another. So this could be a proruption, almost like a buffer, an in-between zone. So the two countries that have disputes do not technically border one another. Anyways, a proruption also for the same reasons, generally tough to control because it sticks out, it's difficult to protect, to maintain, to communicate with. Obviously, information is going to take a lot longer to get through that area. Finally, we have perforated state. Perforated state's a state that has another state located either entirely or partly within it. Think of like Swiss cheese. Swiss cheese has holes in it. If your country had other countries in it, like Swiss cheese, they would be the holes. A perforated state can either be completely surround a smaller one, or it can partially surround a smaller one. Our best example is South Africa, because it has not one but two states that it surrounds in some way. First, Lesotho, right? It completely surrounds that. So South Africa is a perforated state, and Lesotho is the perforation. And also Swaziland, right, is a perforation of South Africa. Even though it doesn't completely surround it, it's a country that is located inside of it. All right. Italy's another great example of a perforated state. It has Vatican City and a second country, Andorra, that is located inside of it. Finally, exclaves and enclaves. Okay, so an exclave is a piece of territory that is part of a state but is separated from it. So, and it can't be an island. So Alaska is an exclave of the United States because it is separated from the rest of the U.S., not by water, right, but by land. So Alaska is an exclave of the U.S., but Hawaii is not. Alrighty? So a non-island piece of territory that is part of a state but lies separate from it. That example of Azerbaijan that I gave just a little bit earlier is a good example as well. What did I do with that? There it is, right? That piece right there, right, would definitely fit as well as an exclave of Azerbaijan. Okay? An enclave is a piece of territory that is completely surrounded by another political unit of which it is not a part. It is landlocked within the country, within a country that surrounds it. An enclave can either be independent or it can belong to another state. So, again, if I may go back to this example, right? Lesotho is an enclave, right? Because it is located entirely within the boundaries of South Africa. Alrighty? Swaziland is not, because is it located entirely within the boundaries of South Africa? No, it technically is located along two boundaries, right? If it were just in South Africa, right, it would be an enclave as well. Alrighty? So again, a piece of territory that's completely surrounded by another political unit of which it isn't a part. Hey, an enclave can be independent, right? Like Lesotho, it can be in its own country but still surrounded, or it can be a piece of territory, all right, that belongs to a country but is technically surrounded by another. Enclaves oftentimes are areas that can turn into shatter belts or can be areas of a lot of conflict, because oftentimes the country that surrounds the enclave might like that land for itself. All right, that's it. I'm signing off here on borders. Next up will be Law of the Sea. Signing out, Mr. M here with your first recording.